Moderator from PBS NewsHour, Lisa Desjardins.
Good morning. I was so happy to moderate this panel because I love the idea of getting to yes. Doesn't that sound so easy?
Would be great.
Gentlemen, I think we want to start and talk about you. You represent, there are several reasons that you're here. You've both worked across the aisle, but you represent two, I would say, middle of the road divisions of your various conferences and caucuses, right? The Tuesday group for Republicans and the New Democratic caucus. Tell me what your hopes are for those groups and how you think they can help get to yes in an environment where we see, it seems, more and more lawmakers on either end of the spectrum than we do where you are in the middle. Start with you, Representative Dent.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for having me here this morning. A couple things. I guess I'd first say that I always felt that our Tuesday group, it's a center-right coalition, and I always felt that we're the governing wing of the Republican Party. These are the people who have the capacity to get the yes, the ones who are usually part of whatever agreement is reached, whether it is on debt ceilings, budget agreements, appropriations bills, the Violence Against Women Act, hurricane relief, whatever it is. It always seems to be the same group. So that's really, I think, largely our function. Our members are ideologically somewhat diverse, but they all have a practical, pragmatic sense about them, that they realize they have responsibilities to move the agenda forward.
One difference being the health care bill, though. Obviously, you were in the headlines, your group was in the headlines as your conference tried to find a bill that could get enough Republican votes. But in the end, it seemed more Tuesday group members voted against the bill that came to the floor than for it.
Yeah, for a reason. There were procedural issues, obviously, but there were substantive issues that many of our members had, particularly on the Medicaid piece, that there wasn't a soft enough landing, the tax credits weren't sufficient to provide health coverage for a lot of people who would be cycling off Medicaid. Some of us didn't want to have the Planned Parenthood issue, and so there were a variety of issues. But there was also a procedural issue that was not inconsequential. It was this. There were those who I felt that were being appeased just to get a bill out of the House, knowing darn well that this bill was going absolutely nowhere in the Senate. And then if the Senate were actually to pass a bill and send it back to the House, it might be more to my liking, but the people who were appeased to get the bill out of the House would be nowhere to be found on the final vote, and that dog doesn't hunt anymore for me.
Let's talk about the Democratic side of the equation here. Do you consider yourself a blue dog? Does anyone consider themselves a blue dog anymore? and because that's the group that was known as sort of the fiscal core, fiscal conservatives for the Democratic Party. Where do you fit in, and what is that model like now?
Yeah, the blue dogs, the few that remain, the blue dogs really were Democrats who came out of, it was almost a geographic designation. These were Southerners, Westerners. You think of people like Ben Chandler in Kentucky, John Barrow of Georgia. These names sort of echo in the halls. We don't have a lot of seats now outside of urban areas in the South or in the Midwest, and as a result, our party, this happens when you get smaller, you tend to become, and this happens to the Republicans as well, as you get smaller, you tend to become more ideologically orthodox. And one of the challenges for the New Democrats is to remind Democrats far and wide, and I'm talking about Democrats, but this applies to both parties, that if you want to govern, if you someday, I remember a majority in 2009-2010, that was my first term. You're going to have a lot of diversity in your caucus. In the Democratic caucus, you're going to have some folks who are pretty strong Second Amendment types. You're going to have some folks that are pro-life. And one of the challenges that we face today is trying to tamp down this instinct that, oh gosh, if that's who you are, there's no spot for you in the party. You can be pure that way, but if you're pure that way, you're never going to have a majority.
So when I see this phrase, getting to yes, what are we trying to get to yes about? And I think obviously the folks here in this audience, and me myself being a sort of debt geek, as I like to say, really concerned about the long term. And it seems that it's been a long time since we've had a significant long-term conversation on Capitol Hill. Maybe you could say Medicaid reform is part of the American Health Care Act. But I want to see if I can hone down on where you all might be able to help drive some agreement, or see if there is any agreement. I guess just follow me along this path. Do you think it's fair to say both members from both of your groups would say the national debt is a significant concern?
Sure.
Obviously. Yes. And then would they say it's a concern that needs to be dealt with significantly in, say, the next 5 years? Or is that where we start seeing differences.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a pretty easy thing to say. The hard thing to say, Senator Warner actually put it out, the harder thing to say is the true thing. In other words, it's free. I mean, there's elements of the Democratic Party that, would rather we not focus on debt and deficits. And by the way, that's been accelerated by the fact that, starting 8 years ago or 7 years ago, we started using language like, we're 2 weeks away from being Greece. This is the single most catastrophic. And for 6 years, United States treasuries have been low. There hasn't been a catastrophe. But the hard thing to say, I think Charlie would agree with me on this, the hard thing to say is not that the debt's a big deal. The hard thing to say, for the Democrats, the hard thing to say is, by the way, what the president's new budget doesn't say, which is the long-term real fiscal challenge, that if we're serious about fiscal issues we will talk about, it will be the need for reform in our mandatory programs, in Medicare and Social Security. Very, very hard for a Democrat to say that. The hard thing, I'll let Charlie riff on this, but the hard thing for a Republican to say is, gosh, if you do the math, you kind of need to look for some new revenue sources. That's pretty hard for the Republicans to accept.
Is that hard for you to say, or just Republicans?
Well, I think what's easy for me to say is that we already have a model to look at. It was the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And in the House a few years back, we had a vote, and 34 of us, I think, voted
38,
for it.
38.
38, excuse me, 38. Should have been 110, but nevertheless. That's what they thought they had going in.
Number of signers of the Constitution, by the way.
Yeah.
So that's a good number.
There you go. But bottom line is, I'm not saying that was ideal, that program, but it was a very good starting point. And that had a mix of mandatory savings, and there was also revenue. So I think we have a place to start. Now, to me, this requires presidential leadership to tackle this. And we have to be willing to do it. So I don't think it's as hard as people think. We kind of have an idea what the policy discussion should be. It's a matter of political will at this point.
And we have today the president's budget proposal being announced. However, he is proposing what he calls a large tax cut. I went through the numbers. I need to sort of see how that shakes out exactly, because in the end, if you look at his spreadsheets, the revenues for individual taxes and for corporate taxes are flat. You don't actually see a decrease in revenue, so it seems like he's moving revenues around somehow. But anyways, he says he wants a tax cut. He has left Medicare and Social Security, the two issues that you all both say obviously needs to be dealt with in the debt. He's left those untouched. So it seems almost like the president is not addressing either side of the equation here that's needed to national debt. How do you, as folks from Congress, try to motivate, try to change that?
On the budget? Well, first, as an appropriator, I've often felt the budget process in Washington is simply an exercise in Confederate money. It's not real. What I mean by that is, when it comes to the budget, there are only really two things that matter, as far as I'm concerned. One, it's a responsible top-line number, what we call the 302A number. That sets the appropriations levels. And the second thing is the reconciliation instructions. And I suspect that will be on tax reform. The rest of it is a messaging document. It's aspirational, makes a whole bunch of assumptions, some of which are not good, some are. If growth is at 3.5%, if Medicare is turned into a premium support program, if Medicaid is block granted,
right.
If Obamacare is repealed, and on it goes. It makes all these policy assumptions that may or may not ever be realized, certainly probably not in that fiscal year. So the point is, the president sends over a budget, he proposes, we dispose, and I think one of the challenges with this budget is because the president's taken Medicare, Social Security off the table, and has also asked for a significant increase in defense spending. Not only leaves the domestic discretionary spending available for cuts, and that's 13 or 14% of all federal spending, and I don't think it's particularly realistic. I mean, for example, in the skinny budget, we saw about a 20% reduction in NIH. Well, we just passed the FY17 appropriations bill 2 weeks ago, and we increased NIH by $2 billion. State Department takes about a 29% cut. And there's some other things that we just don't think are particularly realistic. So bottom line is, at some point we're going to need another debt commission, and we're going to have to get serious about it.
Where do you think that point is? I mean, I think we've been talking, we've known this point was coming for probably a decade, that we've needed.
I suspect when interest rates pop.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's two forcing functions, right? And sadly, again, look at the president's budget. It's a how-to and what not to focus on, right? It's tax cuts. It's leaving Medicare and Social Security untouched. To my democratic eyes, it's pretty regressive in a lot of ways. But there's really two forcing functions. I kind of hope these forcing functions don't kick in. I hope we can figure out a way to beat them to the door. But number one is, as Charlie says, interest rates. At some point, the market, and sadly, some people thought that was 6 years ago, and you have a little bit of a boy who cried wolf thing going on with interest rates. But if interest rates pop, first of all, the amount of money we're going to need to spend on interest is going to accelerate. But the other issue that's going to happen, and it'll start happening in the next 5 to 10 years, is eventually the mandatory spending in the budget, which is mandatory, will begin to consume the entire budget pie. And that's not a function of anybody's irresponsibility. It's a function of an aging American population. And when that happens, there's about 3 members of Congress, who don't want any spending on anything. Everybody else has some element of spending that they really like. It may be defense, it may be, something else. But the point is that all that goes away as a mathematical function because of the aging of the population. So eventually we're all going to wake up and say, wait a second, there's no money for anything. And sadly, if on that morning, that's a pretty tough time to address the growth of mandatory spending. If we did it now, we could have a ramp that would be, much more kind to people who rely on those programs.
You said to me a really interesting thing when we were walking in about how you think it needs to start with a bipartisan bill or a bipartisan idea rather than have to come back to at the end, as we've seen so many times, as you were saying, Republicans in the House especially having to acknowledge that they need Democratic votes, which we've seen again and again for the most part, as you were saying. But how does that happen? Can we write a bill here today? Yeah. How do you get these conversations to not only take place among thoughtful members of Congress, and then how do you take that conversation to leaders who are thinking about the next election rather than I'm sure it's in the back of their mind, but the next election is more in the front of their mind than the debt curve? I guess that's the essential question. How does that start? What's the first? Are there conversations between Republicans and Democrats at this point, or is it all relationships like this?
Well, in my view, in order to pass any kind of meaningful reform, or meaningful, durable, sustainable reform, it always ends up being done on a bipartisan basis. So take infrastructure as an example. I mean, I think there's a genuine desire to move forward on an infrastructure bill. That issue lends itself to some kind of bipartisan collaboration. You may be able to even tie tax reform to, if we do tax reform right, we might be able to find a sustainable revenue source for some infrastructure. And so I think there's a way to move forward. I think a lot of Democrats want to see more projects. A lot of Republicans want to see some process reform. How we go about building roads and bridges and highways and that sort of thing. So I think there's a great opportunity right there. But we have to start realistically. I mean, I've always worried that the House will try to load up the bill, make it as palatable to the hard right as possible, and sending it over to the Senate. And then and a lot of my colleagues in the House at times pretend that the other body doesn't exist. They think it's a unicameral system, so we send it over to the Senate, and they're just shocked when the Senate changes the bill and sends it back to us. And then we are often forced to eat it. I'd like to actually send the bill over to the Senate that they might have to eat once in a while, or that they would have to have a hard time rejecting out of hand and make modest adjustments.
Do you see things the other way then? Do you see bills leaving the House and you're so happy that the Senate is going to change them with the current atmosphere?
Of course, you love or hate the Senate depending on whether you want something to move or not. And so, again, as we watched that healthcare bill go through, we thought, well, at least it's not going anywhere in the Senate. So no, but I mean, I remember a million years ago when we were in the majority, and it's that old saying of that Washington congressman who, the kid comes up to him and says that Republican is my enemy, and he says, no, son, the Republicans are the opposition, the Senate is the enemy. And so, yeah, really.
As long as the press is not the enemy, I'm happy. But yeah, that's right. But I think we're trying to get to this idea is how, in an atmosphere where it seems leaders are paying most attention to those closer to the ends of your party, as to in the middle.
On the first launch. Always on the first launch, I've noticed. But at the end of the day, we have to come to an agreement. And to get anything through the United States Senate, outside of what we call reconciliation, you need 60 votes. So last I checked, there were 52 Republicans. That means there'll be at least 8 Democrats for anything that's going to get to the president's desk. We have to start, I think, from there, recognizing what we get 60 votes for in the Senate. Try to write the bill as close to that agreement as possible in the House, then send it over. That's what I would do.
Let's talk about tax reform. As a Democrat, what do you think you could bring to the table on tax reform that might have some bipartisan hope?
Well, like infrastructure, I think Charlie would agree with me on this. Like infrastructure, I think there's ideas that are broadly accepted across both parties. I mean, most Democrats will agree with you that a 35% corporate tax rate, highest in the OECD, is too high, and it leads to stranded capital and that sort of thing. No question we would agree that the tax code is too complicated. It gets a little, everybody has their pet deduction and credit, but even there, you've got the President of the United States when he was campaigning saying that the capital gains treatment of carried interest, and I promise you, no district in the country has more carried interest than mine does. But
Fairfield, Connecticut.
Fairfield, Connecticut. And so again, there's lots of areas in tax reform where I do think there's strong bipartisan agreement. But that's just such a heavy lift. I mean, there's a reason why tax reform last got done in '86 when the President Reagan had 60% approval ratings. It's a huge and heavy lift within the Republican Party, and then once the Republican Party figures out whether they want a border adjustment tax or not, and they come to us and we'll have our things, and then of course you've got, every credit and deduction out there has, some organization in town that's going to fight like hell to keep it in there. So there is a lot of bipartisan support for a lot of different ideas, but boy, is it a heavy lift.
Is there something in particular that you think would make Democrats feel more excited about tax reform? Some particular aspect of it that could bring more Democrats on board?
Well, this is an idea. I mean, the idea that I started with is not necessarily a Democratic or Republican idea. Look, you can't look at trillions of dollars stranded abroad and hear from CEOs that they would love to bring that money back, but the tax numbers don't work, and say, how is that a good idea? So again, I'm not sure that's a Democratic or a Republican thing, and you'd have a lot of Democrats supporting the idea of a concessionary rate to bring that money back and a permanent lowering of that rate so it doesn't get stranded. I don't know if that's Democratic or Republican. That's just kind of smart.
Republicans don't need Democratic votes technically, as it is. However, it looks like potentially, practically, they may if they go through reconciliation. Is there an advantage to try and bring? You talk about you think you want those 60 votes, you want a bill that can be bipartisan, but what's the motivation for your leaders to try and be bipartisan? I understand your personal motivation, but why would Speaker Ryan want to reach out to Democrats?
I suspect we'll move forward on tax reform through the reconciliation process, although I don't know that we'll be able to pass tax reform through the reconciliation process, because it's particularly in the Senate, you don't have much margin for error. You have 52. So if we can't do it we can't do tax reform through reconciliation, that might force us back to a more traditional route of tax reform. And I believe that's how they did tax reform back in in '86. I don't think it was done on a reconciliation basis.
No, I don't think it was either.
My memory serves me correctly. And again, like Jim mentioned, there are issues where I think there is agreement. We all understand that we might need to move toward a territorial tax system on the corporate side, as well as allow for repatriation. That's a stimulus we would all like to see. Bring trillions of dollars home to America. Let that be invested. So I do think there's an opportunity still to do this on a bipartisan basis, because we may need to marry up tax reform to infrastructure. And as we were lowering rates, we might have to find other revenue to help pay for the infrastructure package, outside of repatriation. And I suspect that might mean we might lose some Republicans and we might need to pick up some Democrats for that.
Is this like Jenga? If one of these things comes out, if tax reform does not happen, is infrastructure possible? It's the one thing I keep hearing Democrats and Republicans say they feel that they can get to on. Is it possible without tax reform or a delay in tax reform?
Well, again, tax reform is such a heavy lift and could take so much time that if infrastructure is important to you, and it's really important in my district in the Northeast, you really say, oh, geez, really, we're going to have to wait for the tax reform thing to go by. It's really discouraging. I kind of wish in an alternate universe maybe we had started in January on infrastructure, which would have, again, drawn lots of bipartisan support, would have maybe healed some of the divisions that came up, through November, but we didn't start that way.
Yeah, and I
was that ever a consideration as far as you know?
I don't think it was enough of a consideration. I thought we should have moved in that direction, but that was me. And I just heard Senator Warner mention something too on tax reform, that to get the rate down, I think the president wants to take the corporate rate down to 15%. To do that, we'd have to find, it's hard to do it by just eliminating deductions or credits, loopholes. And so the debate on tax reform is how much of it will be paid for. And I think that's, so it gets back to border adjustability, and is this going to be a tax cut or a tax reform? And that creates, challenges within the Republican conference, because we have some who are more, deficit hawks and others who are less so, at least when it comes to tax cuts. So I mean, that's another challenge that we have to face, and so that's why I think that reconciliation may not be as easy as some people think, just because of the internal dynamics for us as Republicans.
I'm sorry to have to ask this question, but how much of this is politics? How much of this is policy? You know, I love talking to members like the two of you who are deep in policy, who are thoughtful about it. There are many more members, I think, than the American public realizes who are that way, who came here to do policy. However, when I'm in the halls in Congress, the first thing out of many members' minds is political. And I know that part of that is messaging. But I also feel that in the leadership's mind, this is a very political moment, and they're nervous for that reason more than policy. How do you get past that, and how political are all these discussions right now? It's nice that we're having this great policy get to yes discussion, but the politics seems, how much in the way is that?
Well, it's always in the way.
Right.
I mean, you can't really escape it. I mean, it's just there. But, you know, on the budget, I mean, again, back to the budget, I like to beat on the budget, because it's fun. But the budget, the budget process,
you're in the
though,
right
I mean,
place.
it's just, I've often found that the budget is just an exercise. It's the most partisan exercise we've got. You know, the budget is always, whoever's in charge passes it with their votes. There's never any bipartisanship on the budget. And again, it's all about messaging. It's aspirational.
Marie Ryan was a moment of bipartisanship.
But that wasn't the budget. That was
Right.
that was a
Right.
budget agreement.
Right.
It was a little
Right.
different.
Right. No, I
which,
understand.
and all they
I
really
understand.
did
Still.
was
That's right.
establish what the budget is supposed to do, which is
Right.
to establish that top line appropriations number. That's all they're really supposed. That's all that budget agreement, mostly what it was. That's it. But that was done outside the traditional budget process, and again, that was done on a bipartisan basis. You know, unlike the budget,
Right.
you know, was always partisan. But that was a bipartisan agreement, and a lot of people took some grief for that. I voted for it, and I was happy to do it. But it gave us some budgetary stability, at least for 2 years, in terms of knowing what numbers we were going to be working with. And the FY17 bill was the second year of that budget agreement.
You have more members in the Tuesday group than the Freedom Caucus does, yet you also have more vulnerable members, probably.
Yeah.
Is that a factor, you feel, in the weight that leaders give to the Freedom Caucus versus, or is it how the two groups maneuver?
Well, I think with our group, I always say it's a bit eclectic.
Yeah.
You know, we have a bit more diversity. The group's not monolithic, so it's not so easy for our group to come to a consensus maybe on a given issue. But our members do have a very, like I said, a very pragmatic, practical sense. And oftentimes, you know, we can get a good sense of the group about a way to proceed. You know, the Freedom Caucus is more likely to take a position where they will, you know, they'll take their, whatever it is, 30 votes and say, you know, we are no, and they'll stick. And that's why they're effective. I mean, it doesn't mean you can advance anything on your own, but it means you can block things. And so that's why they have some real impact, because they have that ability to stick together on a given issue.
What's the pressure like among Democrats right now? Are the conversations such that you feel that you can, behind closed doors, really talk about talking to Republicans? Or is this an atmosphere where Democrats are happy for President Trump to be out front, happy to wait for what they hope will be a political disaster for Republicans? What is it like behind closed doors?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very dynamic. It sort of depends on the day and what, you know, tweet we've all woken up to or whatever that determines the atmosphere. Generally, and I think the leadership has been constructive about this. The leadership, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, they have continued to reiterate that we will work with the president, we will work with Republicans on issues like tax reform and the budget. Obviously, we'll have our progressive values, but I think they've worked to tamp down. I heard Nancy Pelosi do it the other day, to tamp down the impeachment talk. That's not constructive at this point in time. So there is, I think, a strong impulse to want to work, but the window on that has slowly been closing, and it becomes harder. I mean, there is an element in the party, and just as there is in the Republican Party, of saying the way we're going to govern is we're going to take them down the way evidently Mitch McConnell said on day 3 of the Obama administration, that's the model to govern. You know, we don't get anything done until once again we have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. I've heard that articulated by very smart people, and it's a dark, dark vision, right? Because it means that you're going to get a shot once every 10 years, and you're probably not going to succeed. I mean, the Republicans, even though they own all all three of those entities are having a hard time getting stuff done. And so,
and that's too late. That's too long of a time curve. But
yeah, no, I mean,
to keep missing it.
Again, when you say politics, I kind of bristle at the idea: is it policy or politics? Look, politics is how we do things in this country.
I'm glad you busted
as
me
Rahm
on that.
Emanuel
Yes.
used to say, politics is the
True.
alternative to beating each other up on the streets, and that's a good thing. But politics only works if you eschew the vision of we do it our way or no way, we compromise. And this is, I think, the message we're trying to convey, which is nobody gets celebrated for compromise, but that's the only way you govern the country.
That's a beautiful way to end this.
I'll be here all
But
week.
I think hopefully the crowd here, this is the one place where I believe you may be celebrated for attempting to compromise.
That's right. It's
And trying to
small
get
crowd
things
there.
done. So Representative Jim Hines, the 4th District of Connecticut, thank you very much. And Representative Charlie Dent, 15th District of Pennsylvania. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.